You're listening to the Meet the Farmers podcast with me, your host, Ben Eagle. Please remember to subscribe to the show wherever you are listening. Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 299 of Meet the Farmers, the show in which we get to the heart of farming life in the UK and beyond, speaking to the people who grow the food, manage the land, and work in or shape the future of agriculture in some way. I'm your host, Ben Eagle, and today we are zooming out to take a global view before zooming right back in to see what it means for local farms across the UK. And we're calling this episode Global Shocks, Local Farms, Wars, Climate, Trade, Politics and Beyond. So we'll have a bit of everything today. And today, more than ever, really, farming doesn't happen in a vacuum, of course. The challenges and decisions facing UK farmers are increasingly shaped by forces far beyond the farm gate. We're talking about conflict and instability in key producing regions like Ukraine today, climate change and extreme weather events, trade policy shifts post-Brexit, rising input costs and an unpredictable political climate at home and abroad. And I'm sure we'll dig deeper in future similar episodes, but today is about big picture thinking. And to help us make sense of it all, I'm joined by two expert guests. First up is Emily Norton, who is Director of Farm Foresight and is a renowned commentator and strategic advisor on rural affairs with over 25 years of lived farming experience based in Norfolk. She's well known for her insights on rural strategy, agri-policy and sustainability, and has actually just started at time of recording her post as the incoming chair of AHDB. I'm also joined by James Bolesworth, who is Managing Director at CRM Agri-Commodities, who specialise in interpreting grain markets, international trade and price risk for farmers and ag businesses. James is based in the Cotswolds. And so together we're going to explore how big picture shocks are affecting UK farms right now and perhaps ponder how this might run out in the future and how farmers can stay resilient in the face of change. So Emily, James, thank you so much for coming on and doing this. I'm really excited for this episode. Welcome back to the Meet the Farmers.
Yeah, thank you. It's great to be here.
Let's start with a sort of section on wars, trade, market volatility. In terms of global events, let's zoom out to an international scale, first of all. I'm interested in your take, first of all, in terms of the events that are having the biggest direct or indirect impacts on UK farming. That's possibly the broadest question that you could possibly have. Emily, I'm going to start with you.
Oh my gosh, don't start with me. I think James is just way better placed to kind of like think about this because it's really showing up in global commodity markets. Yeah, of course, they have like that impact at sort of grassroots level. But, you know, the biggest disruptions, I think, that are having those indirect impacts are the way that just geopolitical tensions are playing out. So, yeah, I'm definitely bumping that one to James.
Yeah, James, your turn.
Yes, I think, directly and indirectly, the impacts are huge. And I think often it's more nuanced than it immediately meets the eye. So obviously, you know, we know the past couple of years we've seen an invasion of Ukraine by Russia. And we know as a result of that, food price inflation went up. But then since then, actually, it's the knock-on impacts which we've seen around the world that actually are sort of having the longer term effects, and we think will play out down the line. And by that I mean, you know, inflation obviously has led to higher interest rates, which in areas like Europe and indeed the UK, we've seen currencies strengthen, which then of course in turn impacts our ability to trade or export, or it means that importing is more competitive, and that, of course, has a direct impact on commodity markets. So it's those sort of impacts which maybe you don't think about on a day-to-day basis, but from a geopolitical and macroeconomic standpoint, they have a huge impact on the sort of day-to-day farming businesses and the price of goods being bought and sold in the market.
And certainly, I mean, when it comes to cost of inputs, if we zoom in on that, say, it's the subtleties of change, isn't it, that people are interested in. So actually, if we go back to COVID, but then if we look at those few years since, have there been significant events that have caused that, or is this actually a much bigger phenomenon that we're talking about?
If you're looking at inputs and take, for example, fertilizer costs, they were, of course, to a degree driven pre the war in Ukraine by all of the supply chain disruption which came off the back of COVID. And the fact that we then saw a huge shift in supply chains, and the market had to get to grips with quite a sudden change very quickly. And then I think since then, we've seen things settle down a bit, but then you've sort of seen again this long-term impacts of these structural changes, and we haven't quite seen everything calm down since. So, gas prices remaining elevated has quite a significant consequence on a lot of these input prices, and the ability to gain these inputs from places like Russia, where they were flowing far more easily before the war than they are now, is another example of how these things have shifted, and the impacts on a domestic level have been very clear.
Hmm. Emily, what's your take on the political ramifications of all of this? Again, we're just taking a broad brush look at the context of the last few years, but actually that pressure, what are the push and pull factors been in terms of the politics of all this?
So the way I see it is kind of a bit more of a sense of urgency around trade in particular, in terms of where those tensions or where those dependencies and where we thought we had trust and good trading relationships, how they are being tested by some of the global factors. And we think about the US in particular when we think about that being disruptive. But that's sort of requiring, as I see it, this kind of like diversification, where we're now thinking about how we can do trade deals with other parts of the world, and how that's kind of been able to prioritize some of those thinking and some of those opportunities. And the political bandwidth for that stuff has become way more important. So in all of this kind of negativity and news, there is huge opportunity. And I think kind of the quiet EU reset that's gone on behind the scenes is a massive bonus for the industry in terms of being able to export meaningfully with reduced costs, reduced friction. And that's really been as a result of, political bandwidth changing, political priorities changing. But because it's not negative, we're probably thinking about it less. So we're still thinking about those negative consequences of perhaps Ukraine less than we're thinking about these positive opportunities that are coming through opening up trade deals, which really support, for example, fifth quarter thinking within the livestock sector, right? So that's where a lot of the profitability comes from. And I think that's where perhaps some of these positive changes might be.
Emily mentioned Ukraine there, James. What is the real impact from your point of view of the continuing war in Ukraine now, as opposed to say last year and before then?
I think, there's a lot changing at the moment. Just last week, for example, we saw the free trade agreement between the EU and Ukraine come to an end, and that one of the direct consequences of that ultimately was that there was more grain flowing freely into Eastern Europe than there was pre-war. And all of that was coming in via road and via rail, or it was moving into Eastern European ports, such as Constanta in Romania, which is a major Black Sea port, which you sort of think, well, how does that impact us here in the UK? But what it does is it uses up the capacity, and therefore is detrimental to European farmers exporting. And that, of course, has a knock-on impact on price, which, if you're a seller of grains, isn't good news. But if you're a buyer of grains, it has, of course, provided opportunities in recent months. But we've now seen that scenario start to change, and we've gone back onto a quota quota system, which means that, going forward, unless there is another agreement made, and again, all these things are still to be decided and are under discussion, but it means that there's less competition next season for European grains and less of a pressure coming from those flowing in from Ukraine. But the negative impact of that is that Ukrainian farmers are then penalised from a price point of view, and it's already a market where we're seeing it's more expensive to get insurance if you're shipping out of Odessa, for example, as opposed to shipping out of Novorossiysk in southern Russia. And so therefore, it means that Russia can export more cheaply, at better value than Ukraine, and therefore Ukrainian prices ex-farm have to fall. So all of these things have consequences, but domestically here in the UK, it should mean that we are seeing less direct pressure next season than we have done in the past couple of seasons.
Emily, that sounds like good news for UK farmers.
It's never good news for UK farmers. I think because we have this mindset that, there's challenges everywhere, right? And we're still waiting for some big decisions around where the funding is going to come from for the things that I think farmers kind of feel very related to, like the sustainable farming incentive and the policies that kind of show up at farm gate level and the things that they can do to de-risk their businesses. And I think having access to those tools is as important as understanding what these global commodity impacts are going to be on the fundamental price, because the price is only part of the risk profile of investing in the production of any crop. The overall fabric of farming and how everything fits together is the farmer's concern, and it's incredibly difficult to kind of manage all of those different pieces of information and different expectations and outcomes. So I think understanding that there are big pieces of the puzzle that farmers need to make sense of, I think it's really important that we continue to access good advice on how to make sense of these bigger picture things, because the kind of the micro, the farm level stuff is pressing and immediate and urgent and on the doorstep. And so against that, trying to work out how you play these markets and make sense of the bigger picture things is really tricky. But there are strategies and routes for doing so.
Yeah, I mean, just throw another thing in there as well. It doesn't seem to be a day going by when we don't hear about another trade deal of some kind. Using the US deal as an example, but there are several others. I'll leave it to you to pick and choose which ones you pick apart. But how do you think that UK farmers should interpret, I suppose, the shifts in trade patterns that we're having to negotiate in this new sort of post-Brexit world? James, do you want to start on that?
I'd say cautiously is probably a way of rounding it up, but in reality, we've seen some headline announcements, but we know very little at this stage about a lot of the detail. And as always, the devil is in the detail. And I think we're just going to have to sit and wait and see. There will likely be positive elements of these discussions, but then there'll also be parts of the industry which are impacted. So until we know more about the detail, it's very difficult to make any decisions. It's just a case of being cautious and making sure that risks are managed accordingly, and there's not too much exposure in any given part of the business.
I think the bigger picture is that we're a small, crowded, hungry island, and we have had a long history of importing food into this country. And in understanding where we're going forwards with that, there's a much clearer idea now that we will still be importing food into this country in order to kind of meet some people's expectations of what food security means. The ability to source products from other places to kind of mitigate risks of harvest failure and, whatever else it might be, against this idea of sustaining a level of production in this country in order to be able to meet basic levels of resilience. We've had a lot of papers and insight into that recently, particularly how climate is making that harder, and that need to ensure that we are able to sustain a sufficient level of domestic production to kind of meet those basic objectives. Against that, we've now got more of an understanding of what this government's general approach to trade is going to be. So, our ability to set our own trading policies was one of these Brexit wins. That was one of the reasons why, Britain was kind of advocating to be independent again, so we could go off and actually do these deals and have autonomy over it. So now we've got a few under our belt, and we see that agriculture as a whole has not been thrown under the bus by these deals. Yes, there have been winners and losers as a consequence of them. But thinking about the export opportunity, thinking about the domestic consumption market, and thinking about kind of how farming then needs to kind of advocate for itself to be able to make sense of these bigger picture issues around trade and the opportunity that brings in terms of the economic picture that government is so desperate to achieve. Like, that's, I think, some of the language that we need to try and get to, right? We know that those things have happened, and as a consequence of knowing those things and seeing what they are, like, what do we now need as an industry in order to thrive domestically? So there's a huge amount of the premium local market that we need to be going at, but we need to be selling the less premium, and we need to be able to export the less premium, right, in order to be able to do carcass balance, for example. So sort of advocating into this kind of complex bit, I think that's where we need to be really optimistic and positive on this stuff, to say we have loads of consumers on our doorsteps who are passionate and want British produce. There's that part of it. And then there's a global market of people who also want that high quality traceability and really good stuff to be able to, eat and feed their families. And so seeing it as all a threat is not right. Understanding the strategy of kind of government who are setting these deals is correct. Understanding then that there's opportunity, I think, is also really part of the mix to be able to say this is how we make sense of all of this stuff going forwards.
James, do you go along with that in terms of the way you read the markets in terms of opportunity at home and abroad, as Emily's been reading that?
Yeah, I'd say all markets need a healthy balance of imports and exports. It's another way, as we say, as it was Emily as pointed out, of managing food security and making sure, as everybody says, there is a big difference between food security and self-sufficiency, and we need to have food security, and that involves imports and it involves exports, and ultimately that will lead to a competitive markets, and competitive markets lead to technological evolution and everything positive which comes from that. I think the challenge is the abrupt nature of all of the changes which we are seeing at the moment, with very little warning for the industry. Ultimately, having that healthy balance of imports and exports is what leads to food security and a diverse industry, and that in turn is how we can continue to invest and improve. And it's just making sure that that is done in a manner in which everybody can adapt to change as efficiently as possible.
But on that food security note, because we hear these words a lot, don't we? Or phrases, rather, I should say: food security, self-sufficiency. If you're managing your farm, if you're focused on your farm, what is the best way that you can actually keep a drift of all this information, and short of actually just keeping up to date with your particular markets and your particular product lines? Do you need to have an awareness of beyond this? Should farmers be looking into this more?
On one level, yes. I think food security at national level, or even at kind of like individual household level, is not really a farmer's concern, right? But the more that consumers can be enabled to be better off, the better quality diet that they can afford, and that speaks to this whole kind of inequality piece that is this like lose-lose around the poor health system, right? So we're so invested in providing poor quality food to people that keeps them sick. That's a whole different debate. I think for farmers and how you can kind of make sense of these kind of big picture things, particularly with all of these other changes. I mean, it's not just trade. There's changing expectations on how supply chains want to source from farmers, and the environmental credentials that you might be sourcing. Even in commodity markets, you might now be expecting to declare your carbon footprint, for example. Having to build better relationships with your supply chain seems to me kind of like the only direction of travel. Even if you want to be like a proper commodity producer and just play commodity markets, and invest in long-term storage so you can sell off farm at the best possible time, right? Like, even if you do all of that, you still need to be kind of like thinking about the expectations of your supply chains and the fact that those supply chain expectations are changing. So I would think that the sensible thing that any UK-based farmer would do would be to look to premiumise as much as possible where those relationships are, where that value add is coming from, and where the best kind of consumer segments and preferences are coming from, because those will be the strongest relationships. And that might be the best way to de-risk these relationships. Those businesses, those supply chain businesses, want to be able to sell high quality British produce to British consumers and need relationships with farmers in order to be able to do that. So kind of getting past this, head down, hat on mentality to say, okay, who can I work with in order to be able to de-risk and move beyond commodity production, sort of, I think, is probably the inevitable direction of travel. That might be collaboration at farm level in order to kind of think about producer organizations, for example, stuff we're not really thinking about at the moment. It might be kind of better supply chain partnerships, working with a trader to kind of, create a marketing pool. There are lots and lots of different things that can be thought about here, but I think that has to be the direction of travel to de-risk production against this volatility, because the volatility is not just at farm gate to do with global prices. It's to do for the global corporates in this space, the way that climate change is showing up and where they can source from. And also, as we've talked about war as well, like where they can source from, increasingly resilience and resilient supply is going to be front and center of their corporate risk profile. If they haven't got resilient supply, then they've got no product. If they haven't got any product, they haven't got customers, right? So it's going to hit their bottom line really quickly. So understanding that and understanding that British farmers can deliver that resilience, I think, is the kind of space we have to really move into.
Volatility, resilience, premiumization. James, just as a follow-up on this, in terms of a direction of travel, do you sense any sort of shift in these directions?
I think challenging times in any industry breed innovation, they breed efficiency, and some of the fat will be cut out, but I don't think it's necessarily a negative thing long term. And, if we look at agriculture here in the UK, for example, one of the trends I'm noticing is a lot more proactive engagement between end users and producers, who all want to be dealing more directly with one another, be that for provenance reasons or in order to secure more margin for themselves. And so I think, and if you look further afield, and you look to Ukraine, you can guarantee that their logistical capacity and ability to adapt will be better off long term as a result of the challenges which they're facing today. So I think, from that perspective, yes, it is all quite daunting at the moment, but I think there'll be positives to come from all of these changes on a domestic level in the long term.
Let's turn to weather and climate. And Emily, I know with another one of your hats you wear, you're a champion with the AFN Network, Agri-Food for Net Zero Network Plus. So turning to you first on this, I suppose, how do you think that climate instability is reshaping the way that UK ag is done in terms of business and policy?
Well, to give a very micro example, I've just put 2 acres of vines in on my farm because we've got terrible light land over chalk, but on a south-facing slope. And so, you tick all of the future-proofed kind of climate sort of thinking and go, okay, well, maybe this is worth a go. We haven't got access to water on the farm, so we can't, think about sort of certain other crops. So sort of like, high value dry land cropping essentially is the direction that we want to go in, or the only direction we can go in. Admittedly, we're very small farmers, 157 acres. And so sort of thinking about those constraints, and water being one of them as a primary constraint on your business is probably something that most farmers in the UK have not had to think about. And I think long term, we will be relatively blessed in perhaps not having to kind of consider. But if you go to the rest of the world, the fundamental availability of water is the limiting factor on what you can and can't produce. So we might just have to get smarter at how we're thinking about our farming systems based on our water availability. And this idea of abundant water is going to be contested for sure. So I heard something the other day saying that, the east of England as a whole region, which, Ben, I know you're very familiar with, is kind of losing out on economic opportunities. Businesses are choosing not to relocate to the east of England because there is not enough water capacity, right? And you sort of think, well, that's a material kind of future issue, partly to do with climate, partly just to do with the general level of demand and how we're sharing scarce resources, right? And that, I think, is part of this thinking that we're all just going to have to get more used to doing, which is that this sort of the linear model of growing a crop and chucking some inputs on it and then harvesting it at the end, like, doesn't cut it when we're up against kind of resource constraints that are impacted or driven by climate change. So how we're thinking about circularizing systems, retaining natural processes as much as possible to be the underpinning of what we're trying to do. Sort of, that's just everything that I can see as being the future direction of travel. It makes it harder, but actually it's also just how we used to farm. We used to farm without all of the inputs. We used to farm, in harmony with nature. That was the only thing that we could do. Yes, yields were lower, of course, but we've got technology now. So, like, how can we use the smartness that we have available to us to kind of use the best of the past with the best of the future to ensure that we're not making those compromises, right? And I sort of think that's inevitably where we're going to be driven to by things that are very, very out with our control. And climate change would be one of those things. At a certain level, it's within our control, but on a global basis, these things undoubtedly aren't.
From what you're seeing, James, how is the climate response, I suppose, actually impacting on investment decisions? And here I'm talking about farmers, but I'm talking about industry generally and investors.
Commodity markets have always been heavily influenced by climate and weather. Within the commodities cycles around the world, be it corn produced in South America or wheat produced here in the UK or Europe, there are times of year known in the commodity markets as the weather market, where prices are broadly going to be mostly influenced by weather and forecasts. So, there's a lot of businesses out there who make very good money trying to predict weather and sell that data, and that data is being sold both to food companies as well as governments, as well as hedge funders who are just placing bets on whether or not a drought in the US is going to cause a 10% cut in yield. So climate, I think, is and has only become more important and will continue to become increasingly important, and there'll be more money invested in understanding climate trends. And it doesn't look like climate is becoming any more stable based on the past couple of seasons, which we've seen here in the UK, but also around the world. So I think, that climate volatility is something which we're just going to have to get used to ultimately, and develop practices and invest in mechanisms in order to help reduce the impact, but diversify businesses away from direct exposure to climate and weather. And, more broadly, it absolutely is becoming a core part of the discussion around food security, around policy decisions. And, you can only see that continuing to be the way things are going moving forwards.
Let's move on to policy, Emily. And it's perhaps a bit of an unfair question to sort of ask you your assessment, really, of how your policy is responding. But I suppose we can ask the what first of all, in terms of what do you think have been the key measures that you've seen in terms of what are the drivers that are really going to impact farmers over the next few years. There seems to be a lot of change recently. And do you think that those changes are here to stay, or do you predict we'll see changes in future?
In terms of policy, agricultural policy, I think that, we're largely talking about the environmental land management schemes in England, right? But obviously Wales and Scotland are sort of developing their own approaches as well. And in sort of the work that I've been doing, wandering around agri-food corporates and attending events and sort of trying to have these discussions about what their expectations are and how those expectations are changing, there does seem to be like a kind of a core interface problem, which is this confusion between what government is trying to do in providing money to farming and the fundamental function of farming, which is to produce food for supply chains, and how those expectations are changing in terms of what those data expectations might be or what those standards might be, what then supply chains might be willing to pay farmers to do differently. And we hear loads about the regenerative transition and everything that might imply. But there's this kind of real missing link, I think, between where kind of the English government has been thinking about this stuff and how it interacts with supply chain expectations and equally private markets and everything that we see in that, in that space, and the way that the money is available from within government in order to kind of sort of sponsor those outcomes. And this is really showing up because if it's true that there's less money available for environmental investment, then we really need that money to be working smarter. And if supply chains need to be fundamentally invested in the resilience of farmers, then they need mechanisms whereby their limited funds are also driving resilience at farm level, right? So you've got this sort of, I'm doing hand signals, which is terrible for a podcast. You've got this kind of fundamental disconnect where ideally it would jigsaw piece together and everything would work and it would flow. And, what if the sustainable farming incentive became an environmentally aligned economic growth policy for farms? If it really allowed farms to engage with all of these expectations and market opportunity, that's the sort of thing that I think would be amazing. But at the moment, it's sort of just like, well, we've got the money, so how do we redesign it? And I think just rethinking, we've got to kind of keep advocating for what the industry needs. And the industry needs this ability to meet the expectations of our customers. And that's reported back from all of the supply chains all of the time, right? So I think there's definite work to be done.
In terms of sort of, I suppose, strategic direction for a farm, James. I mean, we've outlined a whole raft of different things to think about today on that sort of big level. But if we're thinking of markets, if we're thinking of diversification, if we're thinking of infrastructure, at a time, dare I say, where there is a lot of uncertainty, and there's also, depending on your sector, we've had different amounts of the cash. Let's say that cash flow allowance has been different for different businesses. How can farmers think about strategy for the next few years? And Emily, I'm interested in your views on this, but James, I'll go to you first. If you're thinking in terms of investment, I suppose.
Okay. I mean, obviously, my speciality is more in directly managing commodity market exposure.
Yeah.
But I suppose in answer to your question, looking at all three markets, diversification, infrastructure, it's a balance, really. I think that all are areas where there can be strategic investments, be that from a markets perspective. Looking at, as we mentioned earlier, if you're a seller dealing more directly with end users, or just expanding the markets in which you are trading, and the products in which you are producing and selling, or be that diversifying into other commodity classes, which aren't maybe necessarily purely linked to Trump's tariff policies, for example. And then, if you're in a position to do so, and you own the land and you're able to invest in infrastructure, then of course, long term investing in infrastructure is a very wise strategic decision too, as long as it's targeted and there's a sort of long term strategy there.
Emily, you have a farm in Norfolk. You're planning for investment on that. What would your strategy be?
Like any strategy, you've got to set it carefully and be prepared for it to adapt against your biggest risks, right? And your biggest opportunities. But actually, it's a really personal thing. So, there's no such thing as a standard farmer. There's no such thing as a standard farmer. The reason this industry is brilliant is because it's got a load of diverse thinkers who don't conform to sort of corporate techno speak, right? That's why they're brilliant farmers. It's because, they're doing what they do in that particular way. So kind of working out what works at individual level is the bit where you just need to give yourself time within your business. Farmers are so you call it like path dependency. You're kind of reliant on doing the same thing in just about the same way every year, because that's the way to, minimize risk and, not introducing a load of changes in any one go. But that means like actually taking time out to work on yourself and your business becomes even more important, because it's only through that kind of helicopter view that you get to see everything rather than being busy in it. You get to see on it. I mean, you know this, you've challenged rural leadership type thinking, right? Or any of the ag management courses. Are so valuable to be able to give you that perspective, to be able to set that strategy. And I think against some of the volatility, not just trade, but in terms of tax policy, as we know, in terms of the ag policy stuff that's coming in, you can just end up being so reactive constantly and feeling that these things are being done to you. And the kindest thing any farmer who's kind of just strategy, what strategy? How have I got time to set a strategy? Is to prioritize that time of working on their business, and that might be working as part of a cluster. It might be just taking time out. It might be finding those networks that support network, taking part in those courses, but prioritizing that moment of working and giving yourself the tools and resources to go, well, I'm not going to be able to do all of that stuff. I can't do what James does in terms of like commodity. That's not my skill set, right? That's his skill set. But where am I then finding relationships that means that I can work with people like that, if that's core to my strategy? So I think that's the biggest thing that I've ever learned for myself, is not, oh my God, I need to be all of this stuff. Like I need to learn how to be technically brilliant and market aware and, yada, yada, whatever, all of those different skills. It's not that. It's about saying, like, who else can I kind of empower to help this particular business thrive? Who else is there to kind of do this and begin to build those teams, right? And I think that's the first step, whatever size of business you are, to think about that, to give yourself time and space to recognize what your skill sets, what your preferences, what your areas of brilliance are, and then build that team that allow you to kind of like, build that coherent thing. And then like everything, be prepared to pivot. I think the best businesses do pivot and do kind of work out, where else they can go and what else they can be doing. But it's sort of being kind to yourself first in recognizing what your strengths and weaknesses are.
So just to finish, if we zoom out once again, to a big picture, I just wonder if you can each pick out for me one global trend or shift going on in the world right now that you think UK farmers really should pay more attention to. Who wants to take that one first?
I don't mind going first. I think I've mentioned it already a bit, and I think it is this sort of, I don't want to call it a shift in power dynamics, because I don't want the supply chain to be taking the power. I think it's this moment when farmers, and particularly within a rotation, need to be controlling their ability to kind of like work across the whole rotation to make it make sense, because the supply chain is getting hungry to understand what's happening at farm level. It wants carbon information, it wants soil health information, it needs to know that farm business is resilient. And that might also be your bank, or it could be the commodity processor. It could be lots of different people are very now concerned about sort of the evidence of resilience at farm level. But farmers need to own and champion that information at farm level, and not through the normal process of where power sits in these dynamics and disaggregation just end up developing loads of different supply chain partnerships, which makes the farmer's life really difficult. I think it is possible that sort of processes and innovation can happen to protect farms' ability to own and manage those power dynamics in this space at farm level. And that's, in my mind, the biggest kind of shift that we need to be prepared to kind of take responsibility for. And a simple example of that is within my new hat, the work that the AHDB is doing on environmental baselining. So rather than every farm having to cope with these expectations, we've got better national data on what carbon impacts might be and carbon baselines might be. So there's stuff happening, but I think it's really on everybody to kind of engage in that, so that farmers are really empowered in this future and are retaining control and the ability to make money at farm level against these kind of shifting expectations of commodities coming back down to grassroots level to say, we want to know how you did that. Just maintaining that veil of protection. I think that's where I'd really like farmers to be kind of advocating for themselves.
James?
I suppose going back to where we would be looking in terms of markets, it really is quite big picture at the moment. And I think one global trend which will be significantly influential in the short medium and long term, and has been over the past couple of years, is ultimately global inflation. And I think that is having an impact indirectly in terms of how central banks and governments are reacting to that. And that directly is via interest rates. So we see interest rates rising as a direct measure in order to control inflation. And those interest rates obviously have huge impacts on farm businesses' abilities to invest and the cost of debt. But also, those interest rates have a huge impact on currencies. And those currencies, as I mentioned at the start, impact our competitiveness in terms of global trade. And so, if we have a strong currency because of high interest rates, then it means we're going to be less competitive in the global export market, and therefore prices suffer as a result. So, that inflation number is going to be key. And ultimately, at the moment, inflation is moving in the right direction, but much more slowly than expected. And so what we need to see is that inflation continuing to drop and therefore interest rates falling. And that in turn brings more investment into commodity markets. And that helps to support prices, as well as leading to weaker currencies, particularly the dollar. So it's not directly something here in the UK, but it is something which impacts not just UK farming businesses, but global agri-businesses. And it's absolutely critical in terms of prices we receive here in the UK.
Well, a conversation going full circle. We will leave it there. But if you want to keep up the conversation, please do get in touch with any thoughts you have on any of the content from today. You can contact us at hello@ruralpubmedia.co.uk. But a big thank you to my guests, Emily Norton and James Bolesworth. Thanks, guys, for coming on.
Thanks for having us.
Brilliant.
Yeah, if this episode helped you think a bit differently about the global forces shaping UK agriculture, please consider leaving us a review or sharing it with a fellow farmer. Next time, for our 300th episode, I'll be joined by the brilliantly inspiring Tim Parton. But for now, I'm Ben Eagle. This has been Meet the Farmers, and thank you very much for listening.